Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by John Fallon. John was formerly CEO of FTSE 100 Pearson plc for 8 years, during which time he led a major digital transformation, which he's described as incredibly challenging. In spite of these difficulties, by the end of his tenure, Pearson's digital revenue accounted for 75% of total revenue and had become the leading global digital education company. Today, John is a chair of War Child UK, an international charity which protects and supports children affected by war, and advisor at Blenheim Chalcott, the UK's leading digital venture builder, Kira Learning, a computer science education platform, and a McKinsey. John, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
John, I want to jump straight in to your experiences of navigating an extraordinary period of digital transformation. You've talked in the past about the 7 lessons that you've taken from that digital transformation. And one of the ones that really jumped out at me was this closing the gap between a digital infrastructure and analog culture. And that's one that really resonates with me because in my days as an investor, I was sitting on the boards of various businesses. And I often think back to that. How would I achieve what we do now in this business and where we've been able to build our tech stack from the bottom up and we have everyone who's brought in with that disruptive mindset? How would I have implemented that change in those organizations where there were fiefdoms for people to protect? And I just can't get my head around how on earth you go about doing that.
Yeah, and I think it's something that a challenge that any large incumbent faces. There's Tom Friedman wrote a book called Thank You for Being Late, and he attributes, I think, to a guy called John Kelly, who's a senior executive at IBM, this idea that digital change is exponential, just the pace of which, just look at what's happening with ChatGPT and AI just in the last few months. Whereas humans, we tend to change in a more linear fashion. So the bigger that gap is between the exponential change of digital and the more gradual way in humans, I think, frankly, when you are in a business that is going through a very, very big disruption that we did, and I would argue that in our textbook publishing business, what we went through was every bit as challenging as what you've seen in music or newspapers or any other industries, that helps to focus the mind. But ideally, what you want to do is not wait. And it's very easy to say we should just sort of, the Clayton Christensen, we should just disrupt ourselves. But that's a very hard thing to do. That's really partly where my 7 lessons came from. I think the first of my reflections was, there's a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is that the sign of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 mutually contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time and not go mad. And that is absolutely what you need, because if I take the college publishing business, and this was a $2 billion business earning an 80% gross margin. It was by far the biggest profit contributor to Pearson. A decade later, it's less than $1 billion, and yet its share of use, the amount that students and teachers rely on it, is every bit as it was a decade ago. It now has a great future ahead of it. But the challenge was, you can't really believe it's going to happen until it actually does. So I think this idea of a disruptive mindset, this intelligence, this ability to see disruption everywhere and recognize in some places it'll happen and some places it don't. But you always need to be asking yourself, what if the thing that we hold most dear and which is most important to the future of our business, which was college students have to buy our $200 textbooks and they'll carry on buying them because they're depending on them for their study. What if that gets turned on its head in ways that you can't foresee? And so it's that insight, that challenge that I think is important, because every fiber of the corporate being, when something starts to go wrong, as it did in that college business, they'll blame it on a cyclical fact. Oh, well, enrollments are down this year, or it's a weaker year in our publishing cycle, or there's been a regulatory change in Washington, rather than, okay, students still depend on our content, but actually they're now going to a secondary market enabled by Amazon, where they can get hold and access for a fraction of the price, and they're moving from an ownership to a rental model. You want to believe the former. Nobody wants to believe the latter, because if you believe the latter, well, that's really inconvenient. You've got to fundamentally change everything about your business. So I think the first thing in a boardroom is the disruptive mindset. What if we're wrong? How might it be different? How can I live with the different ways in which the world might play out?
Really interesting, and that resonates. I mean, we have the privilege of being the disruptor in our space, which I think in some ways makes it much easier because you're building bottom up. But one of the greatest challenges I feel I face as a CEO is creating that clarity and alignment. Although I have all these disruptive mindsets, trying to get those, especially different cross-functional, cross-silo integration with clarity and alignment about what we're trying to do and moving at the same paces with just a team of 55 people is pretty difficult and not yet succeeding. How on earth do you go about that, doing that in an organization of the scale that Pearson is? And again, through the lens of the board, what is it that you can affect at that level?
And this, you see, and this is where I think incumbents can have a great advantage. And the story I would often tell is when about 2 years before I became CEO of Pearson, I went through a lengthy treatment for throat cancer, and I befriended a Benedictine priest I'd actually never met in my life, but we formed this quite special online correspondence, if you like, where all the things I didn't feel I could trouble my wife and family with, I would share with him. And he introduced me to this phrase from Martin Luther called the cross tests. And I don't think you have to be remotely religious to see the importance of it. And it's this idea that at moments of crisis, strip away all the superfluous things that we'd like people to believe about ourselves and reveals who we are at our core. And I think major moments of industry disruption and digital transformation do the same to companies. And it's really easy when the world's changing around you to get very discombobulated and very confused as to who you are and what you do. So what's really important, the way you get the alignment, is to say, what is it that we do that is of enduring value, that is actually not analog or digital? It may mean a very different business model. We may get paid in a very different way, but what is it that we do that people actually value? And in our case, it was that we created the very best educational content in the world, and we combined it with the very best assessment and the pedagogy, the art and science of how you do great teaching. So what people were actually paying us was to learn something important in as an effective way as possible. They weren't actually paying us for a book or for a test or whatever. And so having that understanding, look at how the Financial Times has made its way through. People aren't buying a pink newspaper, they're buying that insight and that expertise and the belief that they're part of that class of people who are sort of making a difference to the world and need to understand it. So it's that sense of identity and purpose, which I think you really need to focus on, and which can become the thing that enables you to sustain the business and the enduring value that gets you through.
And what role can the board play with that? How much of that is coming from you as CEO and if you had as a chief strategy person, versus is it the board that are helping you? What would you, if you were faced with that situation again on the other side of the table as a board member, what would you see your role in helping the CEO navigate that?
When the Pearson board was working really well, I'd find when things were going well, and they weren't going that well that often, but there were some times when things felt they were going well at Pearson. That was when they would be at their most challenging. And when we were under the caution, we'd had a profits warning and the FT was having a go at me and the share price, that was when they wouldn't be soft on us, but they would be supportive. So I think the first thing about a board is actually knowing when to challenge and when to push, and when to actually put a protective arm around an executive team and say, look, whatever's going on out there, we know that you're mostly doing that. So I think there's partly that, because that builds trust. I think the second thing, there was a generation of CEOs who basically saw the board as something to be managed. We've got to get through, we've got to get audit and we've got to get Remco, but we'll keep them a little bit at arm's length. And my approach was to be much more open and transparent. And I think the fact that I was CEO for 8 years through what was a very, very tumultuous and difficult time, probably the most difficult that any FTSE 100 company was going through at the time, was because there was that very high degree of trust. There was that high degree of openness and transparency. For every board meeting, I would sit down with the CFO and write a letter to the board, introducing the board papers. And it's that moment of clarity that forces you to take a step back and say, what are the 3, 4, 5 big things that the board really need to know, and how do I explain it in an open and transparent way? So I think that helps. And that's where boards are at their best, I think, is amongst all the noise and everything else going on, what are the things that really, really matter to the future of this business? And can we make sure that conversation is happening? And I think it can help with alignment as well.
Really interesting. That trust is something I hear people talking a lot about. In your experience, is that something that has to come from you as the CEO, or is it something that has to come from the board, or is it a combination of the two?
I think it's mutual. If you're being very open and transparent with the board and sharing and being very clear in data, what you don't want is some smart ass non-exec then playing gotcha. I mean, in sharing that vulnerability and saying, well, we got this right, but I think we've got this wrong and I really need help, that they're not just going to use that to beat you over the head. They're actually going to use it to say, okay, well, how can we help? Now clearly, don't get me wrong, there needs to be accountability. And if things have not gone right, then the board needs to be held accountable and should, if they really lose confidence, they have to make the change in the CEO, but there's other ways through remuneration reward plans and all that. So that, take all that as a given. I think the trust from the executive team is to be open and transparent and not try and pull the wool over the board's eyes and not waste their time by diverting them, but focusing on the big issues that really matter. I think one of the big challenges for non-execs is, when I talk about digital transformation and I share my lesson, I'm always clear to say there's these 7 big themes that I think are common across every digital transformation, but how they will play out in each specific business is hugely, hugely dependent on the context. How disruption happened in education was quite different from trade publishing, was quite different from music, was quite different from newspapers in the specific. And so where the non-exec board member is helpful is when they're sharing big themes and principles. If we have, for example, had several board members who came from Unilever who served on the Pearson board. Unilever is a great sort of marketing machine, and their understanding of marketing off the scale to anything. So there's some big themes and principles that you can apply. But if you then try and say, well, you must precisely market a digital learning product in the same way you market Marmite, then frankly, that ain't going to work, is it? So it's knowing, I think, as a non-exec, the balance between big themes and the big principles, but also respecting that the business that you're in here might be a bit different from what your context you're used to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to pick up more on that piece around closing the culture gap.
Yeah.
And actually, I suppose Unilever is an example that has both been feted as a great example of a purpose-driven organization, but also mocked for giving Hellmann's mayonnaise a purpose. It's something that I think as an investor, I probably used to underappreciate. But now as a CEO operator, I know on a day-to-day basis, the numbers don't matter. If I get the people right and their engagement in our vision and their passion right, the rest will take care of itself. But how do you think about that? Again, from a board perspective, knowing whether or not that's happening. When you're a CEO and you're in the business on a day-to-day, you get some feel for it. You have people analytics that can help inform you with that. But what do you think if you're going into a new board today and you're trying to figure out is the CEO on the right track with the way that they are shifting that culture in a digital transformation? What is it that you would be looking for, and how would you be measuring that progress?
So I think it comes through in a couple of ways. And Pearson was a company that was all about education and learning. So if you spoke to pretty much everyone in the company as to why they were there, they would say we're here to sort of empower people to progress in their lives through learning. So a very, very strong mission and purpose, and a belief that technology offered the opportunity to democratize and make education much more accessible and affordable to far more people around the world. And frankly, we couldn't have got through the profits warnings and the restructurings and the amount of costs we had to take out of the business if that hadn't been shared. And it was shared all the way through. Every board member felt it, could tell that story as well as anyone at any level of the company. So I think it's what you do, which is the purpose, but I think it's also the way that you do it. And my predecessor, Marjorie Scardino, had been the first non-member of the Pearson family to be essentially the chief executive. And I think she had still caught some of the best elements of what the Pearson culture had always been. So she would say, our values are threefold: brave, imaginative, decent. That's it. That defines what we do and who we are. And you can't fake that. You either behave like that or you don't. And so we would do things like we'd have, whenever we visited a part of the company in a different part of the world, we'd have a breakfast meeting with several hundred staff. And I would actually ask each board member to introduce themselves. And they would all say a little bit about what education meant to them and why they were involved in Pearson. So there's all sorts of ways you can do it, but it has to be genuine. Has to be real.
Really interesting. One of the other things you've talked about in the past as part of these 7 lessons is about the creating a data-led organization, so not guessing, but using data. Which again, one of my lessons has been how easy that sounds and hard it is to implement in practice, and particularly when you get different stakeholders with very strong opinions and they start suffering from cognitive dissonance where they're just so sure their intuition is right and the data is wrong or being misinterpreted. What's your experience of that? And again, how can the board contribute and make sure that an organization is adopting that in a digital transformation?
One of the biggest mistakes I made in Pearson was I inherited a major digital project that my predecessor had put in place with Apple and the largest school district in America, which was to create a new digital curriculum that would be delivered via the iPad. This was potentially a multi-$100 million you can imagine. This is 12 shareholders love the idea of it. Big headlines. The problem was that the idea was just light years ahead of the reality of what life was like in those schools in downtown LA. And in terms of what the bandwidth of the schools was, the security, training and development of teachers, whether the kids actually had any high-speed bandwidth connections at home, let alone whether the iPad as a platform was anything like mature enough to deliver. So there was all those alarm bells in my mind, but hey, the team seemed confident they can do with it. And what we should have done is said, okay, take a step back. Let's do a pilot. Let's not try and do everything all at once. Let's do one grade, one subject, 10 schools, do a pilot, learn, prototype. And I mean, and in the end, that's what happened. So I think this idea of learn, don't guess is really important. And I think it's happening now with ChatGPT. And it's actually much easier to do with that because you can get the platform and the technology in the hands of lots of people across the company and get them to iterate, get them to try. And I think that's where boards should have more confidence, is actually just do some of that themselves, actually to use some of these products and services. Ask, can I have a access to a product of the companies and use it, because this whole user experience and that becomes really, really important. But learn, don't guess, I think is fundamental in this world.
So interesting. So that resonates so much with me. That I've been guilty of that. I can think on at least 2 separate occasions in the education space. One actually was in with the South Korean investment he had, where there was this incredible vision, and actually we talked to Pearson about partnering up, and we went with someone else in the end. But to me, it just seemed massively ambitious, massively ahead of the time. And I failed as a board member to convince people to take that one step at the time, because there were sort of people on the ground and actually on the board as well who had become messianic about it and were seeing me as the killjoy and wanted to go all in for this ambition. And I don't know to what extent that's something you've experienced, but I've experienced it subsequently, having spent time now in a software business and seeing how blooming difficult it is to get digital projects off the ground, where I'm even more bought into the idea of testing and learning and small steps. But it can sometimes be really difficult, especially when you've got a headstrong CEO who's just convinced they're right, they're convinced they've got to make this bet. What's been your experience of that? I imagine you've had execs as well as...
And building on that, I remember in the early years at Pearson, it was people in the company who were impatient that we weren't moving quick enough, would regularly quote Mark Zuckerberg, move
fast and break
things.
things.
And that used to drive me completely mad, because it completely lacked the context of what we did. With all due respect to Facebook, if you're sort of moving an icon from blue to green, then okay, move fast and break that, no one cares. If you are providing education and assessment that teachers, students and parents are depending upon, that can affect life opportunities and chances for future generations, they don't want you to fail fast and fix things. They want you to make sure you've got it right. And so yes, sort of, this is where the bit of on the one hand and on the other, learn, don't guess, but also have respect for your customers and the importance of it. And I think this is where, if you look at areas like health and education, why digital transformation and disruption has actually been it's a game of inches played out over decades. You haven't seen the same pace of change, because there's a lot of wider cultural and organizational issues at play. And if you don't understand them and don't take account of them, you're just going to waste a lot of money along the way.
I'd love to come and talk.
Another advice to board members who move in it: make sure you understand the context of the industry in which you're working.
So I'd love to expand on that, because education is notorious for that. People, especially in the US market, trying to tackle it from both top down and bottom up, coming through the central agencies and trying to go through directly through the teachers, and often just hitting roadblocks. The teachers didn't have enough time in their day to experiment with new software. The central funded government or whoever else it was just were too bureaucratic, or whatever the issue might have been. What have you learned from your experience going through digital transformations about how to think about tackling a go-to-market strategy? What are the questions, again, someone listening to this, thinking about it for their own board, what are the pitfalls that they're likely to hit, or things they're likely to underestimate?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it's happened so often, it's so hackneyed, that sort of every year somebody in a black turtleneck will stand up at a conference and say, the world of education hasn't changed in 200 years, but don't worry, I'm here now and I've got this idea and it's going to happen. And first of all, the idea that education hasn't changed in 200 years is a complete nonsense. I own my life opportunity. My life is very different from my grandfather's because of the way education has changed in the last 100 years. And I'm sure pretty much everyone has that same experience. But I think now, my view is it has to happen. It has to come from within. And actually, the big lesson I learned in Pearson was disruption and transformation is not something that you do to somebody. It's something that you do with them. So where we have had the biggest and lasting impact in education, and I see it in the work I do now with people like Northeastern University, or where the impact that War Child's having around the world, is where we're partnering with teachers and educators. So we're not trying to disrupt them in terms of barge them out of the way or disintermediate them. We're trying to help them do what they do in a much more with greater impact, and to understand how. So it's about designing it into the workflow of the school, into the learning flow, enable that. This huge market that exists now in corporate training and enabling people to reskill and upskill. Actually, the most effective way that happens is if you can design it into the daily workflow of somebody. So I think working much more with the grain, understanding context, situation, designing it to take account of the sort of, if you like, the non-digital elements of it, I think is really important, because it brings us back to where we started, which is digital change exponential, human change linear. I think human change can be exponential, but you have to think it about in this much broader context. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I remember looking at a couple of those. I remember when it was Edmodo was raising money, and they were burning tens, if not hundreds of millions at the time. And I couldn't even get my wife, who's a teacher, to look at it. She just said, I haven't got time. And so I just couldn't figure out how on earth they were going to navigate that as a go-to-market strategy.
I do think this sort of standing in the shoes of others and understanding it from other people's perspective. I think one of the things we did well at a Pearson board meeting, whenever a couple of times a year, we'd be out in the field in some country, and we would, in addition to making sure we met with staff in the way I described earlier, we would visit customers, or we would bring customers into the boardroom. We'd have them talk about how they would demonstrate how they used our products. We'd meet with students and learners. So I think more boards can actually have that direct interface. And actually, if you do that in partnership between the board and the executive team, it's actually a good way of learning from and sharing with each other. And it sends a fantastic message in the company, because it's all very well the CEO standing up and say, we put the learner at the heart of everything we do, or we're a customer first business. But if there's a board meeting and they spend all the time doing the audit committee and the REMCO and looking at return on invested capital and that stuff, and don't spend time with customers, well, it's not really genuine, is it? So I think that's the other way in which it's important.
Yeah, actually, funny enough, it reminds me, if we used to have an investment in Pret-a-Manger, and one of the requirements was for all the board members to go and do one day on the till a year, just to keep them exactly connected with both employees and customers. They were great at that. I want to go back to a point that you touched on a little bit, and I guess it goes to the point of managing shareholders, stakeholders. You went through 6 profit warnings in 7 years. I think I read in one article. What did you learn from that experience with that board hat on that again, other board members listening might benefit from?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is, I mentioned earlier, we had this one part of Pearson, which at the time was a $2 billion business, our US college publishing business, that was going through industry revenues halved in 5 years without any change in customer use, no loss of market share. It went like that. It's now starting to recover and will go again. And actually, a bit like music, took a decade of decline, and now music industry revenues are higher than they were, and it will go through. But the problem is that takes several CEOs to get through that level of change, and that doesn't help with the annual earnings and the like. So we were in a position where for 80% of the company, we had very good visibility, and we could be very confident how the business was going to perform. For what then became what was 30%, then 25%, then 20%, we could have a good view of what the business would be like in 5 years' time, but our ability to predict what was going to happen in 6 to 12 months was not great. And with hindsight, we should have just said that. The problem is, the thing that spooks the markets more than anything else is saying, well, we don't know. And yet that was we know that what we do is of enduring value, that people will still pay for this, that they're still using it. And we know when we get the other side, we'll have a better quality, more digital business. But I can't really tell you with any degree of, frankly, we don't know what's going to happen in 6 to 12 months. So with hindsight, that's a lesson.
That's a really interesting one. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of, Buffett has been very good with that at Berkshire Hathaway, and basically saying we're not going to report with that any frequency as frequently as others do. They have the annual letter effectively where they do a deep dive, and then there's quarterlies, you basically get no information. And I suppose over time that trust is built up when they're quite right. I mean, I can't predict in our business probably more than about 12 weeks out, let alone 3 or 5. It strikes me that you were remarkably disciplined with your focus and central vision, which I know my own small operation is so hard to do, despite having always counseled as an investor to focus. I guess there are some risks involved with that level of focus. How did the board help you navigate those risks? And do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, there were risks that were underappreciated that someone listening to this who's sitting on a board would do well to look out for, that there are general lessons that they can extrapolate from that?
So I think we got much more, if I compare the board papers and time we spent at the board at the end of my 8 years at the start, we improved hugely because we had to, because we were under this relentless pressure of a company going through what we were doing. And so by the time I finished, we had this sort of milestones report that we would run through the year, and we would focus on different themes at different points, and we had measures of progress, and we tried to make sure that they were measures, not targets, because measures, I think, are a good thing. The danger with once you turn them into targets, there's a law of unintended consequences that you then start to distort other behaviors to get to them. And then we're able to focus the board discussion on where are the clear issues or risks that we were taking. So I think we got much more disciplined and much better at understanding the risks and focusing on the risks. And as I mentioned earlier, having an open and transparent conversation about it. With hindsight, I think the two things that I would like more, I had a fantastic board of really great people who were very, very helpful in many, many ways. There was only one other person on the board who'd ever been a CEO before, and that was the chair, Sidney Nurole. And there were times when I looked around the board table and I think, I wish there was at least one other person around this table who really understood what it's like and the pressure that you're under leading a company through such a big and gnarly transformation under such difficult circumstances. Because we took over £1.5 billion of costs out of a £4 billion business in 5 years. We went from having a workforce of over 40,000 to 25,000. We had something like, I think we had 96 different ERP systems. We had 105 data centers around the world. We had 20 different ways of creating content. We had 3,000 different websites. Just the process of digital, by the time I left, having 95% of the company on a single platform that was mostly cloud-based. The scale of the challenge. And although I think they got it intellectually, I'm not sure they really got it viscerally in the way that you get it if you've actually had to do that. And that brings me on to my second point is we were doing everything all at once. We were changing everything all at once in a very difficult external environment. And there wasn't any choice. Maybe with hindsight, it'd have been better if we'd fixed more of the roof when the sun was shining, but we hadn't. So we were where we were. And there's no point moaning about it. You get on with it. But maybe just been a little bit more sort of forthcoming externally with saying there's a hell of a lot of risk here, and there's nothing that we're doing that we can stop doing to mitigate the risk. We're doing everything we can to manage and mitigate the risk. But the chances of something not going right here, either the external environment been even worse than we expected, or something we do internally not quite working out first time as we hope, is high, and you're just going to have to live with it. It's the right thing to do for the long-term future of the business, and it means that the business will be in better shape in 5 or 10 years' time than it would be. And frankly, it means the business is going to survive in a way that it might not have done. But it might mean in 3 or 6 months' time, you've got an unpleasant surprise that you'd rather not have. And that's just the price you've got to pay. And people don't like having conversations as candid as that because it's scary. And it's frightening. And how much of that do you really want to tell? Because what's the share price implications of that going to be? But sometimes that's the reality of what you're working with and what you're dealing with.
Really interesting. Both of those resonate a lot with me. John, the time has flown by. It's time to go to the wrap up with a 5-question quickfire where I'm going to say a statement and ask you for a short response, if that's right.
Yeah, sure.
So first up, your best book every board member should read and why?
Team of Rivals by Doris Keane's Goodwin. It's a story of the political genius of Abraham Lincoln. Probably one of the very best examples of personal courage and leadership, but also how he brought a very diverse and conflicting team and made them better whilst enabling them all to shine.
Brilliant. I've not read that one. I will add that to my list. Sounds great. Your favorite quote and why?
It's a quote from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's about Jem finally standing on Boo Radley's porch and saying that Father Atticus was right. You never really understand somebody until you stand in their shoes and shuffle around in them for a while. And all the biggest challenges I've ever had have related to people and have normally become much easier to resolve once I stood in their shoes and shuffled around and understood the world from their perspective. And I think we all need to do more of that.
Love that. Your best ever holiday and why?
Any holiday that has involved my wife and my daughters and just spending time when they feel that I am actually out of my own head and in the moment and spending time with them. And 30 and 25 now, so they've got far better things to do, but that's still the best holidays for me.
Was there one particular one that really facilitated that?
All of them, I think, really. We're going back to a place in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, which is a particular place I like because it has that great sense of peace and location when you get there. So that has some particularly happy memories.
Brilliant. Your most significant professional insight?
I do think, well, I quoted F. Scott Fitzgerald once today, and the line of the Great Gatsby is something like, "And so we beat on, boats against the tide." And that was quoted by somebody I was very fond of in the last ever column he wrote for the Financial Times. And to me, it sums up what business and capitalism and is all about. And we've both been in the world of ed tech where people get obsessed with unicorns. Well, I think of Pearson as a much rarer mythical bird, a phoenix. You don't get to be 175, 180-year-old without rising again and again through different iterations and different industries and different disruptions. And sometimes you're riding high and sometimes you're brought low, but you stick with it, you keep going, and you hand the company on in better shape than you find it to beat on and go again. And I think that's the most important professional insight, is that stay in the game, live to fight another day, and realize that you get to play the hand you're given. It's not always the one that you chose, but you got to play it as well as you can and stay in the game, and you'll live to fight another day and live to grow again.
Brilliant. And last but not least, your favorite podcast?
I have got very fond of late of something called The Rest is History, which I like to pick up on. And so I've learned, I was listening, driving down last night. I had 2 1-hour podcasts on the fall of Saigon, for example, but recently done other things around how the Columbus and the founding of America, or the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s and the lessons for today, or any other period. So I really like the Rest is History podcast.
Gosh, brilliant. John, this has been such a privilege. I can see you're going to be brilliant teaching on your new course. So thank you so much for taking the time. I feel like I've learned so much from this. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it, and good luck.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening, and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.